Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Nicole Wallace. Tonight, we're watching a developing story that shifts the ground beneath American politics and perhaps beyond. In recent days, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker issued a stark warning that former President Donald J. Trump may use the military as an instrument in shaping the 2026 election. He spoke of the foundations of our nation being tested and raised the specter of federal intervention in states as a campaign weapon. In one overriding phrase, a domestic political tug-of-war now appears poised to take on global dimensions, with implications for civil-military relations, for the integrity of elections, and for how the United States is seen abroad. Over the next half hour, we'll examine how this plays inside U.S. politics, how it reverberates globally, what's going on behind the scenes, and, most importantly, what comes next. Let's begin. Tonight, we zoom in on what this means for the domestic political landscape. Governor J.B. Pritzker's claim is serious. He alleges that the former president may deploy military or National Guard forces in democratic processes to influence the outcome of the 2026 election. That is not a standard campaign accusation. It touches the heart of how elections should function. On one side, J.B. Pritzker, Democratic governor of Illinois, speaking out about what he describes as potential militarization of politics in the U.S. On the other side, Donald J. Trump and his camp, who have made repeated references to using extraordinary federal powers, federal law enforcement, National Guard, and even military muscle in cities and states led by political opponents, and a broader cast, state governors, local mayors, federal military and law enforcement agencies, plus the public whose trust in institutions may be shaken. What we're seeing is a rising wave of anxiety among voters and officials alike. Pritzker's language, foundations being tested, militarization of cities, authoritarian danger, speaks to something beyond partisan positioning. It issues a warning. This may not be routine maneuvering. Many citizens in traditionally Democratic-led states are asking, what happens if, at the moment of casting ballots, military or National Guard forces are deployed in our states? What if the deployment is not to keep the peace, but to shape outcomes? Some Trump-aligned voices respond that this is fear-mongering, that efforts to strengthen security, immigration enforcement, crime crackdowns, are legitimate. But the intensity of the rhetoric here suggests an escalation of stakes. Elections are the core mechanism of democratic governance. If credible claims emerge that military force might be used to influence or supervise them, trust erodes. Governors and mayors see this as a boundary being tested. What happens when the federal government uses its muscle inside states without consent? For Illinois, Chicago, and other urban centers, this is already a live conflict. Governor Pritzker has publicly condemned what he calls a federal power grab in his state. And for the courts and Constitution, this raises fresh questions. What authority does a president have to deploy troops domestically against the will of a state governor? What are the limits of the Posse Comitatus Act, which restricts domestic military involvement in law enforcement? So from a domestic vantage point, the story has all the elements of crisis mode: political, constitutional, and emotional. Now let's step outside U.S. borders, because as the United States engages in this kind of warning statement, we may use the military in our elections. Other nations and global institutions will watch closely. First, there's perception. The U.S. has long billed itself as the world's anchor for democratic election norms. If those norms appear to be under threat at home, the ripple effect is immediate. Foreign governments will take note. Authoritarian regimes often argue that if the U.S. can do it, why can't we? The mere possibility of military involvement in U.S. elections may blunt U.S. moral authority when it criticizes democratic backsliding abroad. Allies may ask, is the U.S. still a stable model of democracy? Investors in global markets may question the risk of U.S. internal instability. Diplomats may find their negotiating position weakened when they speak of democratic processes elsewhere. Human rights organizations and election monitors will likely issue new caution flags about the United States. That already has knock-on effects on U.S. soft power, which matters in global forums, from NATO to the UN, from human rights treaties to trade negotiations. Spoke with a constitutional scholar who said, when a state governor publicly accuses the federal government of preparing to deploy armed forces in election zones, that is a red flag moment, not just domestically but globally. Another expert on civil-military relations noted, if citizens begin to believe that military force is available to favor one party over another, then the chain of legitimate consent breaks. In short, the global implications are real, not theoretical. The U.S.'s ability to argue for free and fair elections abroad, say, in Latin America or Africa, becomes more complicated when its own internal politics raise questions about the use of force in elections. Additionally, adversaries may exploit this moment. Twitter trends and state-backed media in China, Russia, and elsewhere might amplify the story. Look, even in the United States, democracy needs the military to protect it. That shapes narratives that the U.S. is no longer exceptional. Finally, this could impact U.S. military posture abroad. If domestic deployment becomes regularized, questions emerge about readiness abroad, about the National Guard's role, and about civil military boundaries. Those have strategic consequences. Let's go underneath the public headlines. What's happening behind the scenes in the corridors of power? Governor Pritzker isn't just issuing warnings. He's taking legal steps. Illinois filed a lawsuit to block federal deployment of National Guard troops in Chicago, challenging what he calls unconstitutional federal intervention. The White House, or former White House in this story, is using rhetoric of law and order, homeland security, immigration enforcement, and positioning major cities like Chicago as emblematic of a failure of local governance. That framing is strategic. If you can depict a city as chaotic, the case for federal intervention becomes easier. On the campaign side, some Republicans argue that the Democrats are inflating fear to drive turnout. Some Democrats argue the Republicans are crossing traditional boundaries of executive power to consolidate control. Inside the military and guard systems, there is likely internal unease. The National Guard answer to both the state governor, for state missions, and the federal government, for federal missions. Dual-hatted responsibilities are being tested. And behind the scenes, there's the question of timing. 2026 midterms loom. The 2028 presidential cycle might already be in motion, and positioning now matters for control of Congress, state legislatures, and the narrative. One White House source told me off the record, "This is not just about Chicago, it's about precedent. Once you normalize the federal military in local elections, you've changed the game." Meanwhile, a state-level official said, "We feel like the federal government picked a target. We were not asked if we wanted them here." Note the emotional tone. Behind closed doors, governors are worried about autonomy, about their constituents' trust, about precedent. Federal actors are worried about losing ground if they do not act aggressively. That tension rarely plays in public with this degree of clarity. Lawyers are already debating whether deployment violates the Posse Comitatus Act and related statutes that separate military from domestic policing. For example, courts have flagged that federal troop deployment to cities without state consent is legally fraught. So while the muscle is visible, the law is murky. And that ambiguity is exactly what you want when you're testing boundaries. In short, behind the press conferences is a high-stakes chessboard of law, power, optics, and timing. Let's turn to the future. Where do we go from here? What are the next steps and consequences? If Pritzker's warning proves valid, 2026 may become a turning point. We might see a federal push to deploy National Guard or active duty forces in targeted states or cities ahead of November elections. Legal battles in multiple states over whether such deployments are legitimate, with cases potentially reaching the Supreme Court. Increased mobilization among voters who feel their local state's autonomy is under threat or whose trust in the system is eroding. For Democrats, this becomes a rallying cry. We must defend democracy itself. For Republicans, this may be portrayed as necessary action to protect law and order, or as bold leadership. The tension will deepen. If the federal government is seen to intervene in state elections or create conditions favorable to one side, we could see further polarization, but also increased engagement and turnout. State governors may push more hardline responses, refusing federal troops, legal countersuits, mobilizing National Guard under state orders, instructing voters about potential federal actions. Over the longer term, if this becomes normalized, the boundary between military and policing in the U.S. will shift. The Guard and federal forces might increasingly serve domestic missions during election cycles, which could reshape civil-military relations, citizens' trust, and the meaning of state sovereignty within the Union. This may also open door to reforms, tougher oversight of federal deployments, clearer legislation defining when and how troops may be used domestically, or even new activism around voter rights, election integrity, and guard deployment. Scenario A, the federal government backs off after pushback, legal defeats, and public backlash. This becomes a warning moment, but not a turning point. Scenario B, deployments happen in one or more states in 2026. Legal battles ensue, polarization intensifies, trust in elections drops, turnout shifts dramatically. Scenario C, a hybrid outcome. One or two limited deployments. Legal reforms follow. New norms established about federal-state coordination. For everyday voters and citizens, the key takeaway is keep an eye on state-federal announcements, National Guard activations, and whether states are asked to or told to accept federal forces ahead of elections. What we're witnessing is more than headline politics. It's the potential reshaping of how power is exercised in the United States, how the military, which has traditionally stood apart from partisan elections, might be drawn into the heart of them. Governor J.B. Pritzker's warning may prove prophetic or may serve simply as an alarm bell. But regardless, the stakes are high, so stay sharp. In the coming months, we'll see how state after state reacts, how federal actors respond, how courts rule, and how voters interpret all of this. Because in a democracy, the rules matter, and when they're tested, everyone watches. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Nicole Wallace. We'll keep watching these developments closely. Good night.